Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior and welcome back to yet another History of Breakdown and Analysis. Now in today's video we're going to be talking about a member of the Shogun Kingdom and champion of the Tigrar bloodline, Kintaro. Now to really talk about Kintaro properly, I actually first have to talk about the Shogun Kingdom as well as Outworld itself. As you see, before the very first tournaments and even rise of Shokan, there was simply just Outworld. After the defeat of the one being by the hands of the Elder Gods, his physical body would be separated in what we would now know are the realms of the Mortal Kombat universe. From here, each of the realms would bring forth life, and Outworld was a very interesting case, springing forth a number of different races. This ranged from the Outworlders themselves, to the Centaurs, to the Shokan, and even dragons. Upon the realm's creation, each faction fought for power and order. It kinda helped assert a hierarchy and idea of who really sat at the top. But that's not to say it was all smooth sails on the Shokan front. You see, within the Shogun Kingdom, there are in fact two somewhat races of Shokan. The first and most prominent in the series are those that derive from the Draco lineage, taking on physical traits and abilities from the royal dragon bloodline, and are somewhat seen as the true Shokan. Because of this, the Draco lineage had seen more success in the kingdom, with perfect examples being Goro and King Gorbak. But what of the other race? Well, they are simply known as the Tigrars. Now the Tigrars are unfortunately seen as a lower class and race in the Shogun Kingdom, and thus because of this are not given the same love, privilege or respect of their Draco counterparts. Whilst it hasn't been explored in depth too well, it is widely believed that they are looked down upon because they are not seen as purebloods, taking on the visual characteristics of a tiger instead of that of a dragon. But that's not to say that they didn't push back. Despite their restrictions and limitations, there was one warrior that stood out and even commanded the respect of the Draco lineage, and that was Kintaro. Although it is not well documented, we do know that Kintaro is from a long lineage of strong and powerful Tigrar champions within the kingdom, having fought tooth and nail in order to prove their worth. But before this conflict could really be resolved, there were far more demanding wars at hand. The most infamous was their blood feud with the Centaurs, a battle that was born at the dawn of the realm, having soaked Outworld ground with their blood. This fight would go on for many generations, but eventually this would be halted when Shokan had risen to power, with the Dragon King Onaga dead by the hand of the Emperor. The ruthless tyrant would set his eyes on conquest, but he knew he couldn't do this alone, and thus recruited the likes of both the Centaurs and the Shokan. Now, initially both sides were not okay with this, as working together was something they did not see possible, but with the possible genocide of their race looming over their shoulder, they knew that they didn't have much of a choice in this, and thus both sides bent the knee to Shokan. Now, although they did work together, the tension and rivalry was still there, and both races would ultimately work against each other, trying to earn the favor of the Emperor in the hopes that he would snuff out the opposing side. Now, following these events, Shokan was successful in recruiting the Shokan, Centaurs, and Tarkatans, meaning that he had now assembled his army. From here, he would travel from realm to realm, conquering worlds and burning them beneath his feet, as he won tournament after tournament. They were even able to enslave the likes of the beautiful Edenia, but it wouldn't end there, as Shao had turned his gaze towards Earthrealm. But much to his surprise, they proved to be far more troublesome than any other realm. Raiden and his champions defied him at every single turn. Even when Shao had taken one of their own, Shang Tsung, and taught him the dark arts to battle them, he would be defeated by the great Kung Lao. Thus, the Emperor decided to resort to other means, the Shokans and the Centaurs. Now both sides presented the very best that they had to offer, and whilst impressed with his selection, Shao only had his eye on one fighter, and that was Prince Goro. Now because of this, the Shokan were elevated to a higher status among Shao's empire, but this isn't a position that would last forever. Now after the recruit recruitment of Goro, Outworld saw much success in the Mortal Kombat tournament, with the prince vanquishing the great Kung Lao and then going on to win 9 consecutive tournaments. It seemed like a sure finish, and that is what brings us up to our very first game. Earthrealm, on their final legs, was able to forge a warrior that wasn't only able to contest with the prince, but defeat him and Shang Tsung. Liu was able to successfully save Earthrealm and thus give it a second chance. But before he could enjoy this victory, tragedy would strike. Upon Liu Kang's victory, Shang Tsung's island would crumble, with Prince Goro apparently being a victim to its destruction. With Goro supposedly dead, the Shogun Kingdom would send forth their next champion, a representative of the Tigrar's fury, Kintaro. So this actually brings us up to Kintaro's debut, Mortal Kombat 2. Following the events of Goro's demise, the Shogun were both rattled and outraged, with Kintaro placing Goro's death on the shoulders of Liu Kang, thus wanting the Shaolin's head. Now, despite Shao having lost in the first game, he decided to raise the stakes and attacked Earthrealm directly, with Kintaro being amongst the group. Shao had done this in order to draw them out to his Mortal Kombat tournament, as he had captured their allies. Now, with the second tournament underway, Kintaro set his eyes on Liu Kang, who at this point had defeated everyone flawlessly in his way, and even when the Tigrar champion battled the monk, Kintaro was simply outmatched and outclassed, losing to the Shaolin. After this, Liu would go on to defeat the Emperor, and thus Outworld was stopped once again. But in the Emperor's defeat rose a bitter and angered tyrant. Mortal Kombat 3. After Kintaro's defeat, Shao had ultimately lost his faith in the Shogun, and thus now placed his trust in the hands of their arch rivals, the Centaurs, something that understandably displeased them. The Shogun were now put into a lower class and were shunned by the Emperor, and from here, Shao would strike. You see, while Shao had his forces invade Earthrealm, he had secretly created an alliance with the Centaurs to exterminate the Shogun, so a war would be waged on 2 different fronts, with the Shogun only being aware of the attack halfway through Earthrealm's invasion. Now, whilst it isn't really known, it is believed that Kintaro did return back to the Shogun Kingdom in order to defend his home, but there isn't too much information surrounding this. Now, following this event is where things do get a little hazy and confusing, as Kintaro does take a long absence, with his next game being Armageddon, but a number of different things transpire in between that time. Following their betrayal, the Emperor would go on to once again be defeated by Liu Kang, and whilst he returned back to Outworld in a weakened state, the Shoguns and the Centaurs were still feuding with each other, bathing Outworld in their blood. That is, until Kitana interfered. Having recently freed Edenia with her mother from Shao's clutches, Kitana has both sides come to the realization that they are both simply just pawns in Shao Kahn's game, and that if they were to work together, Outworld could exist without the tyrant. And when both sides realized that this was the answer, they would forge a non-aggression pact. But the peace wouldn't last forever. A few years would pass, with the Shogun Kingdom pushing back against Kahn's empire. But before they could defeat the Emperor, tragedy would strike, with Prince Goro having apparently been slain in battle. But this was all a ploy. You see, Shao Kahn, who had faked his death, had Goro do a similar thing, so that together they could reclaim Outworld and bring forth the destruction of the Centaurs. Naturally, because of this, Kintaro followed suit, and to begin this assault, they would first cast an ancient Shogun spell, transforming the Centaurs into Minotaurs. This in turn leads us up to Kintaro's final appearance in the original canon, Mortal Kombat Armageddon. Now, Kintaro plays a very small role in this game. Whilst he does appear in the conquest mode of the game, this is not canonically him, but instead an illusion created by Shinnok to test the capabilities of one of the sons of Argus, Taven. Kintaro makes his first big real appearance during the Battle of Armageddon, where he calls forth the forces of darkness against the forces of light. This of course happens at the end of this continuity, as it is a battle where characters die on both sides, with Kintaro being one of them. But things aren't quite over just yet. Mortal Kombat 9. At the end of the Battle of Armageddon, Shao was able to absorb the godlike power of the fire elemental Blaze and bring on true Armageddon. But before he can relish in his victory, Raiden would send a message back to his past self, effectively resetting the timeline and rebooting the continuity. So the MK timeline that is born is a somewhat cracked reflection of the original canon, with different changes and alterations. Kintaro is actually a character, however, that largely remains unchanged, making his first appearance during the second tournament of the game. Now here, unlike the original canon, he battles Kung Lao instead of Liu Kang, but in both timelines, he does ultimately come up short against the Shaolin. But this isn't the last time we do see him. His next big appearance is during Earthrealm's invasion, where he can be seen in Striker's chapter. He confronts the officer and his partner Cabal, to which he then fries Cabal to a mere crisp, turning his gaze to the officer and charges at him into combat. Now just narrowly by the skin of his teeth, Striker is able to pull off the win, but the Tigrar champion isn't put out for good, making his final in-game appearance during Cyber Sub-Zero's chapter, where we see the cyborg take on the powerhouse duo of Kintaro and Goro. And despite the brute force of the Juggernauts, Wei Liang is able to slide his way into victory, defeating the two and freeing their captives. And thus, this is our last and final look at the Tigrar champion, but it isn't the last time we truly do see him. Now you might want to have a keen ear for this part, because this is where things get a bit convoluted. Following the events of Mortal Kombat 9 and Shao Kahn's defeat, there was in fact a comic book series that was created, that being the Mortal Kombat X comic book line. It was designed with the sole purpose of bridging the huge time gap between Mortal Kombat 9 and X, in turn allowing us to learn what had happened after Shao's fall and the Outworld Civil War. Now the reason I say this is convoluted is because whilst it was originally designed as a canon comic book series, at the end of 2020 this comic book line was in fact retconned and then became pseudo-canon. What this means is that there are certain aspects of the comics that are canon, whilst there are other bits that do not come through. So the stuff you hear in game is what happens in the comics, and from what you can more than likely tell, it doesn't make things entirely clear. But for the sake of you getting the most out of this episode, I will be covering it nonetheless. So with that said, Mortal Kombat X. Following the events of Shao Kahn's defeat, there is a huge power struggle in Outworld, with Mileena and the Oztec KOTOR fighting for the title of Khan. Eventually, after much bloodshed, KOTOR is able to acquire the title, but this doesn't deter Mileena, who forms her own faction in the desert of Outworld, binding her time to strike. But how exactly does this involve Kintaro? Well, one of Mileena's allies is in fact Prince Goro, and during a battle with KOTOR, the prince's arms are severed and he returns back to the Shogun Kingdom shamed by his opponents. Because of this, King Gorbak perceives this as a personal attack and rallies his Shogun army to destroy KOTOR and his city. This attack would in fact be spearheaded by none other than Kintaro, leading the charge into Outworld's capital, where he would kill and slay all who idolize the Oztec. The battle is bloody and fierce, with KOTOR having to call upon the special forces and Black Dragons for assistance, and eventually with some help, the Shogun are eventually pushed back and their king Gorbak would be slain by KOTOR. In a last-ditch effort, Kintaro would continue to fight back, but he is eventually outmatched and overpowered by KOTOR. But instead of killing him, KOTOR shows him and the Shogun an act of mercy, letting them know that they shouldn't be fighting each other. This entire war was orchestrated by Mileena's own foul play, so if anyone was supposed to be held accountable, then it was her. Although Kintaro doesn't believe his words, the rest of the Shogun would drop their weapons, and peace was created by the two sides, with Kintaro and his fellow Shokan returning back to their kingdom. From here, a tournament would take place to crown a new king or queen, and Kintaro can actually be seen here, telling the former Prince Goro that due to his severed arms, he's no longer viable to compete, to which the bitter prince leaves, swearing that he would return with an iron fist. Now, following the events of the tournament, it would be won by Shiva, who in turn would become the first ever queen of the Shokan. Now, due to their low numbers, Shiva wished to forge a better relationship with Kotal, but during this time, Kotal and his allies had been drawn to Shang Tsung's island after learning of a dangerous plan created by Havoc and Reiko involving blood magic. When they heard of the commotion, they immediately set off to hopefully assist in the Khan's battle. Now, during this journey, Kintaro made it no secret that he did not like or trust Kotal, and this actually causes a bit of a dispute with Shiva. But before this could be resolved, the ship would be obliterated, and Kintaro was almost killed until Shiva stepped in and saved his life, as it turns out that Kintaro cannot swim. When they washed onto Shang Tsung's shore, they would be treated by Reiko's foot soldiers, but before they are struck down, they are saved by Devora, who reveals to them that the blood magic Reiko had acquired was being weaponized and used to transform him into a blood god. So together, with some assistance from Kotal's allies, they storm Reiko's fortress, only to learn that things have only gotten worse, as Reiko was killed by Havoc, and the Chaos Cleric was now in possession of both blood magic and the amulet of Shinnok. During the skirmish, Kintaro does his best, fighting off the possessed Earthrealmers, but eventually he is overpowered and decapitated by a possessed Sonya Blade. Luckily, due to some interference from Scorpion, Havoc's influence is severed, freeing them of his control and the blood code, but the damage had been done, and Kintaro was dead. Now, to honor his dedication and sacrifice to the Shokan people, Shiva promised to have Kintaro be taken back home and be given a true warrior's send-off. So unfortunately, this is the last time that we truly see Kintaro. So with that being said, this has been it for the history of Kintaro. I hope you have enjoyed this video and learnt more by doing so. Now, a little known fact about me is that I'm actually a pretty big fan of Kintaro. I've always visually loved his designs and how it is tied to the Draco lineage. Because of that, it doesn't feel like he's simply Goro 2.0 to me. Now, with that said, here's a fun question for all of you. Out of all of the sub-bosses in the original trilogy of games, who was your favorite? Seeing as I have covered them all just recently. Please do comment down below, as I'd honestly love to hear what you all have to say. Also, a quick heads up, next week I will be doing a history of episode on a member of the Black Dragon clan, the Stone Cold Killer Tremor. So you definitely want to stick around for that one, especially if you are a longtime fan of the character. But until then, that has been it for me. So if possible guys, before this video wraps up, let's try getting it to about 500 likes, and please do not forget to tick that bell, as it will keep you up to date with all of my content, including more Mortal Kombat movie news. So now, as always, please comment, like, subscribe, and share this video with everyone you know. Please take care, and I'll see you all next time.